A warm welcome to all of you here to the Institute for Human Sciences and to our lovely library. My name is Ivan Vejvoda. I'm the acting rector and head this Europe's Futures program and fellowship. And I'm delighted to have two of our fellows today who will be presenting. To my right, Janka Oertel, and to my left, Olivia Lazar. And as in our previous colloquia, we will hear successively both fellows do their presentation. We will then open it up for a discussion and questions and answers from the floor, and then we will hear the second presentation and follow the same pattern. And we should end in about an hour and a half. So first to go will be Janka Oertel, who comes to us from Berlin. Janka is the director of the Asia program at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, she was a senior fellow of the Asia program at my former house, the German Marshall Fund for the Fund of the United States in the Berlin office, where she focused on transatlantic China policy, including emerging technologies, Chinese foreign policy, and security in East Asia. And prior to joining GMF, she served as a program director at the ERSTE Foundation Berlin office, and of course, many other things. Janka will be talking to us on a subject related to China and Europe, and the title of her presentation is Need for Speed, Europe, China, and the Competition for the Green Tech Transition. Janka, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ivan, and thank you very much to Ivan for the kind invitation. It's a great honor to be here, to be one of the fellows. I greatly enjoyed being here in Vienna as well. It's fantastic. So maybe just before I set out kind of the framework of what I would like to look into more in depth during my time as a fellow, just to see how I came to this conversation. The China conversation has morphed into something that is much bigger than a foreign policy issue. And all of a sudden, China scholars like me have to look into all sorts of areas that normally not have any interaction with. So 5G, climate change, all of these topics all of a sudden have a huge China dimension. So it's kind of hard to grapple with it. So what we're trying to do at the moment is just kind of find creative ways and how we can, in a kind of interdisciplinary fashion, make these really complex challenges that we're facing today handleable, make them understandable, and break them down. And we will try to help from this kind of Asia perspective and the China perspective in this regard. So when Secretary Kerry was in Tianjin early in September this year, he was trying to make a plea to the Chinese side, basically saying climate change is more important than politics. And that's already the fundamental distinction, because for Xi Jinping in China, it's relatively clear that climate change is politics. And that's when it becomes really complicated at the moment. We in Europe have been very successful over the last few years, decades even, to move the climate agenda forward, to move the discussion about decarbonization forward, to keep some of these debates alive even during more difficult times of the Trump administration. China has swung in late to this conversation, but we have not been kind of we've not been so welcoming in the beginning of others kind of taking that space as well. This is a European project. We want to be seen also as the climate leaders. But when President Xi Jinping announced in Beijing's commitment to net zero carbon emissions by 2060 in September 2020 at the UNGA, this came as a pretty big surprise to many, not least within China itself, among its own government, among provincial leaders, business elites, and intellectuals. While China was nominally committed to limiting the rise of global temperatures and the global fight against climate change, China had thus far not been regarded as any kind of front runner on the agenda, but more as kind of a reluctant follower, willing to use the climate card whenever needed, to leverage it to further its own economic, political interest in multilateral negotiations. So the first question after this announcement was, is he serious? Is that going to be a sustainable agenda that he would be? And my argument in this is, yes, he is, and we better be very careful about this. We see new coal power plants being announced in China. We see lack of ambition in the 14th five-year plan. And there are lots of voices, particularly coming out of the United States, saying they're not going to really do this. They're not really serious about this. They're going to use this as leverage. Well, that is true for the short term. But I think what we are seeing and developing is a dual track strategy that is coming out of the Chinese side. There is an interest in change in policy, not because the Communist Party has found its kind of inner tree hugger or wants to save the world from the devastating effects of climate change. The reason is a lot more profane, but therefore also a lot more convincing. The agenda that Xi Jinping is following at the moment is interest-driven, the interest of the Communist Party. China is very vulnerable to climate change. If we look at the coastal cities, if we look at droughts, if we look at floods, we've seen that over the last few months, how the devastating effects can look like very quickly. There is not a huge climate conversation in the Chinese public yet, but that can change. And that is something that is that the Chinese government is very much aware of, that the vulnerability is high. So if you look at the coastal region and the important economic hubs there, you easily can have a conversation about rising sea levels and what this would mean for economic output. There is a cost dimension to this, that coal prices are rising, renewable energies are getting cheaper. So the question is, what is the economic argument behind it? There's a social stability argument. How much does the future of kind of the Chinese social stability depend on also the factors that will lead to an environment that is conducive to prosperity and to a good life? But all of this would not be enough. And Xi Jinping's government knows that China is vulnerable to climate change and knows about the devastating effect for years. So what has swung it at the moment is more that is reinforced by a market logic. Xi Jinping is going forward with what is called the dual circulation strategy, making China more independent from the world, but wants to make the world more dependent on China. The pandemic sort of serves as a catalyst in this regard. It is a situation where the decoupling agenda is actually working in China's favor here. It is real, and China is driving the decoupling agenda itself. It is actually trying to get more independence here. That includes energy independence, and renewable energy investment in that regard are really helpful. There's also a green supply chain logic. If you think about the net zero targets of big technology companies, for example, Apple or Chinese companies, then this exerts enormous amounts of pressure on the entirety of the supply chain. That also includes Chinese suppliers at various parts of the supply chain. If you want to continue to be able to produce in China, you need to green the economy there as well. So this has a dual and a reinforcing effect. So if we look at, because it is such a good day today to look at it, today is the start of the UN General Assembly, and we kind of have the 1 year anniversary of Xi Jinping's announcement here, then I would argue that Xi Jinping's UN General Assembly speech should be seen in sort of the same category as the 2013 Kazakhstan speech that he gave, that basically set out for the start of the Belt and Road Initiative. Something where in the very beginning, everyone thought this kind of regional thing, or is this really a thing? Is this going to lead anywhere? And if we just zoom a few years later now, then we see we're facing a global challenge, a globally active China, and they were very serious about the things that they were saying there. European companies in this regard also play a role. So just a few months ago, for example, German chemical company BASF secured access to 100% renewable energy for its new kind of on-site production in the one site in Zhangjiang. This is happening in cooperation with local suppliers. So Guangdong, which is still heavily dependent on coal, will reduce the coal factor in the energy mix, not because the politicians are telling them so, but because also the markets are demanding this. Basically saying, if you have as a global company now a global demand for green energy supply, then you can use this as a pressure factor as well. And are you going to build your factory here? Or are you going to build your factory there? So the southern Chinese province now plans to install 4 gigawatts of offshore wind power by the end of 2021, and to expand this to 18 gigawatts by the end of 2025. For comparison, in Germany, we have 7.7 gigawatts of offshore wind power installed by the end of 2020, and by 2030, we would like to be up to 20 gigawatts. So the dimensions are quite enormous. There remains an enormous challenge in decarbonizing China. That has to be very, very clear. This is not something that will be easily done, and this is not something that Xi Jinping can just declare and then it will happen and everyone will follow along. That is very clear. But the trajectory is clear, and I think this is what we need to be kind of mindful of what's happening. It is harder to bring the provincial governments on board. It is harder to kind of create a system that is conducive to this. It is really hard to think about what are the same problems that we're facing, jobs in the coal industry. How do you deal with it? How do you deal with the social instability that comes from these kinds of developments and transformations that are ongoing? China is not only investing in renewable energy, but also heavily in nuclear technology, testing new kinds of nuclear power plants as well. The ambitions are high, investments in technology are huge, and sort of there's a testing out strategy going on at the moment of from carbon capture and storage to nuclear energy to massive investments in renewable energy. You see the whole portfolio, and that is they're playing with. There's an experimentation process that is really helpful if you have the ability to spend massively here. In Europe, we still see ourselves as leaders on decarbonization and green tech. And in many parts of Europe, you would say, if you ask them, China as laggards. This is something that we say, no, they're not really there yet. This logic would be my argument no longer holds, and that we have to take the Chinese ambitions very seriously. That leads us to conflicting goals. We want China to be successful in its transition. This is important for mitigating the effects of global climate change. It is absolutely crucial for our own goals in that regard. But at the same time, we do not want to lose our competitive edge. And this is where we run into problems in terms of what are the goals that we're actually pursuing. We have run a little study at ECFR that's called Home Advantage, together with Agatha Kratz from Rhodium Group, where we tried to just explain how the size of the protected home market that China has provides a huge competitive advantage in sealing that off, particularly in areas where there's a lot of government procurement. So from telecommunications in the area of energy, we also looked at railroading stock. And you can see that the sheer size of the Chinese market provides you with scaling capabilities that then, for example, in the solar industry, it wasn't subsidies that were actually the problem in eradicating European solar industry, but it was the scaling opportunity in the Chinese market. And as long as the Chinese market remains closed to international competition in these sectors, there will be a huge and enormous unfair advantage that will allow Chinese companies to grow, to be incredibly competitive, and not because the government is spending so much in them, but just because they have very preferential conditions on their own market. As an example, Siemens Gamesa just announced in August that they are leaving the onshore wind business in China entirely because that market is not lucrative for them anymore. The onshore business is gone. Only home companies, only Chinese indigenous companies are going to maintain in that market. It's not true for offshore yet, but I think it's a good example of how quickly these things can develop. This is where then the analogy to our 5G conversation that we've had in Europe kind of comes into play. The wind energy sector is a really good example because we are still leading on the technology side. We are very successful on global markets, but we are losing markets. We are open, China is not. And this logic needs to be addressed. A green authoritarian-led China, which continues to move away from the idea of real market economy and fair international competition and aggressively represents its own interests, is an enormous challenge in that regard. So how can the competitiveness of European providers be secured without entering into a subsidy competition? Which technologies must Europe itself retain in the area of critical infrastructure with a view to strategic sovereignty? Where can cooperation with partners in the Indo-Pacific and transatlantic result in the kind of necessary synergies in order to survive in the competition for technological leadership and market shares? What does energy security actually mean in the age of renewables? And how can path dependencies in this regard be reduced? In the current ongoing conversation we have in Berlin in the election campaign, all candidates are basically that are running for office are basically saying that the green transition will help maintain prosperity. This will be our investments in the future. This will maintain jobs. This will be important for our own kind of future prosperity. The same goes on in the United States, where Biden's climate agenda is about jobs, jobs, jobs that these will create in green industries. But I do think that we need to include the China factor in our equation, because otherwise it will not add up in the end. And this is where I would say we need to look very closely in how we can see what it will take to actually make that prosperity promise of the green transition possible. For that, we need a good understanding of what China's doing. We need to understand that there is a difference in this debate to the 5G conversation, because we have an overarching goal of saving the climate, which adds an enormous layer of complication. And all our confrontation with China is not an option. And we need to find a European approach to strategic industries, bring new coalitions together, and to help level the playing field in said markets. So I would like to look further into the details of this over the next few weeks, but that's kind of the big question that I'm grappling with at the moment.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you very much, Janka. And as some of you know, after our first 3-year cycle of fellows that have been dealing with crucial topics related to the European Union, questions of democracy, foreign and security policy, and the enlargement, this year we have expanded the area of our research to the issues of Asia, the challenge from China, and of course the green agenda. And that's why we're happy to have both Olivia and Janka with us. So I haven't maybe alerted Olivia, but we allowed the co-fellow to ask the first question. So I guess you've understood that. So Olivia, please go ahead and pose your question or give a comment to what Janka has said.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Janka. That was very enlightening. And I'm very glad that you went first for the presentation, because I think that the presentation I will give, will provoke a good conversation. You provided a really useful piece of information. If I understood you correctly, you make an analogy between the UNGA announcement from last year regarding the 2060 climate neutrality goal and the Belt and Road Initiative announcement from, I don't remember what year.
2013, yeah.
There you go. I'm keen, I wonder if you can push the analogy further and sort of tell us about the milestones that the Chinese Communist Party went through in order to detail and flesh out what the BRI strategy would look like, and how it became, how it played essentially on an internal conversation about ecological civilization at home, which is now written in the constitution in China, and how it sort of, became this massive development, foreign policy, geostrategic, vision that is now the cornerstone of Chinese interests in the world. So what kind of milestone should we look for in terms of strategy development in the next few years regarding how carbon neutrality will play out at home, but also how it will play out in a foreign policy project for China?
I think it's good to kind of dig a bit deeper into this analogy as well, because what I think is important is sort of understand how the Chinese system ticks in that regard.
Yeah.
When in 2013, Xi Jinping announced the BRI, this was not a fleshed out strategic project within the Chinese system. It basically went ahead, and then later on, everyone swung into this agenda. Everyone kind of made their own little thing about it. There was money behind it as soon as you could say it is BRI related. And it evolved into this own dynamic that it then created this kind of massive support behind it as well. Because it also, there's smart Chinese entrepreneurs that were swinging in behind it, was saying this is all kind of Belt and Road related, but it had this bringing the entirety of the system behind it basically saying, you figure out what it means. I'm giving you the framework here, but you figure out how we're going to go about it. And I'm just I'm reminded of that because of also the surprise that was coming out of the Chinese system after the announcement. It was like, oh, hang on, wait a minute, we're doing that now? When we didn't know that we were doing this now. And I think this is how you now see, this is why I'm not so skeptical about the 14th five-year plan, which was really shortly afterwards, because that wasn't ready yet. They were just not there yet. But I think if we only look at the really short-term implementation phase, and that's when the milestones come in, I think we need to look at a multitude of factors in this. So how are the Chinese banks changing their credits ratings, for example? How are provincial governors, how is provincial leadership rated? Is it still GDP growth, or are there going to be sustainability goals more heavily enforced in that regard? How is the regulatory system changing over time? What are the announcements going to be? And I think it's much less, and I may be wrong on that, I don't know, but this is my gut feeling at the moment. We may see less of an activity at like the COP in Glasgow and a huge ambitious kind of new NDC. I don't think that we necessarily see that, because that would limit the flexibility around this. Right. It would kind of tie China at a moment where they are also grappling with economic slowdown due to the pandemic, where they are having not only their green agenda, but also their massive red agenda going on at the moment in terms of common prosperity and changing the system, in terms of more equal distribution of wealth, cracking down against tech companies and all of that. So there is a multitude of factors at play there that maximum flexibility is very good. So I would look more at the long-term dynamics of this. This is a 2030, 2060 agenda that is playing out here. But I do think that just saying, well, this is long, this is in the future, far away in the future, and therefore nothing will happen, would then those market logics wouldn't play there as well. So I think that's the factor that makes this really different. Otherwise, I would be a lot more skeptical. But if you see what's happening with Chinese companies and how they are announcing, how they see the opportunity, the large opportunity that presents itself in this green agenda, then you can see how much capacity this can mobilize in terms of just entrepreneurial outputs. I would look at banks, I would look at what the companies are doing, I would look at announcements of companies that are happening, and monitor closely what's coming out of the 20th Party Congress next year.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, please do.
So as part of the BRI, China has outsourced a huge amount of environmental pollution and carbon emissions. Do you see China aiming to develop a sort of foreign policy arm that we may call climate diplomacy, the same way that the EU is trying to do that, in spite of the fact that it outsources a lot of its environmental pollution and environmental destruction?
I think what we're not seeing yet at the moment is, so what are going to be the long-term implications in terms of its infrastructure developments, investments in coal, etc. We can already see very slowly that there's going to be less investment in that, just also because it's not lucrative anymore. Now, there's a very clear market logic behind this. Building a coal power plant is not going to be the most economically clever decision for the next 30 years. So there is that factor already that you can see. Then there's the pushback against the BRI in certain countries. We can see that element as well being an enormously important factor. But then on the other hand, I think what we need to be very mindful of is that we will continue to see a mix of this. You will not see that this is the new direction and this is exactly where this is like, there's going to be a lot of transition here. There's a lot of long transition phase. The one element that we haven't spoken about yet is kind of China's international image and how that factors in, as well as the role in the developing world, its image with regard to kind of wanting to also lead on these questions and wanting to be seen as that. In that part, kind of the BRI investments will play an enormously important role because you can no longer justify a kind of strategy that export it at a time where your developing country fellows that you see yourself as part of and as kind of as primus inter pares are all suffering from climate change much more than the developed countries will. It's pretty clear that the impact is going to be a lot harder and heavier for them. And this is going to be much harder to sustain. So in the end, we'll see where exactly we will see the changes, but greening the BRI has been a conversation that's been going on for quite some time now. Right.
Okay, Solly, and do introduce yourself, please.
Solly Oertel, I'm also in your cohort. question and then play the devil's advocate. Was there any, I mean, China, to the extent that I followed your topic in there, is an environmentally devastated country to begin with. I understand that people have been unable to see the real color of the sky for a very long time in Beijing and elsewhere. And given the fact that this has also become a middle-class country, was there pressure on Xi for actually coming with that declaration and surprising his Communist Party comrades? Secondly, though, and in your answer, you talked about private investment company. Well, if you were giving this talk 2 years ago or a year ago, you talk about Jack Ma and how energetic. Can he tolerate this? I mean, is there no tension between his desire to become a second Mao or an emperor and the entire Communist Party system to be maintained? And the kinds of things that you say can be accomplished only if they allow other sources of power to emerge.
So the first on the thank you very much. So on the pollution versus climate change question. So what we are witnessing in China is a kind of a distinction between those two debates. Environmental degradation and pollution is not necessarily linked to the climate change conversation. It is pretty much kind of delinked in public discourse. There is no overarching bigger climate conversation, but a very local pollution conversation going on. And this is one that has been, because it has such a massive socially destabilizing effect, because it affects people in everyday life, it is already being one of the top topics that is being addressed by the party already. There are goals in bringing down pollution, there are clearer environmental goals in that regard. This is really important because it is something that is a danger and a direct threat to the Communist Party. So, but that doesn't necessarily lead, it hasn't over the last few years led to a massive change in the climate conversation that we were having. That's why the surprise was so big that, you know, if we had a kind of Greta Thunberg style Chinese uprising for global climate change, but that hasn't been the case. So far, it has been a lot more localized. So therefore, it is relatively top down still in terms of the kind of introducing this narrative into the discourse. The second question is a big one. It is one that was really hard to find the answers at the moment, whether he can navigate this. The crackdown that we're seeing at the moment against private companies goes hand in hand with a strengthening of state-owned enterprises, with a better distribution of all the different power centers that are emerging, to be able to control them all simultaneously. But at the same time, this is obviously hugely risky. They're eradicating billions of euros out of the market with decisions that they are taking at the moment in their tech crackdowns. They potentially stifle innovation. You know, there's huge question of whether and how long this can be maintained. But I do think that from a European perspective, banking on Chinese failure is probably not the best strategy. Is rather preparing for China's success in these areas and taking that as the scenario that we kind of benchmark our own actions against and see that as a regard. Because as you can see with today's stock market volatilities already, we are already so closely interlinked that China's failure in kind of maintaining economic growth and in maintaining stability would have a huge impact on global markets and on our own economies as well. So it's again one of those areas where it's hard to say what actually is our goal in this. Do we want Xi Jinping to succeed, or do we want him not to succeed? And it is on us also to define more clearly where exactly we would like to see what kind of reaction and what is it that we can do to bring that about. I think just being a lot more strategic about that. Something so far, and I'm speaking here as a German, the German economy has been making billions in China. This has been a fantastic ride. This has been so good for the German economy. But the question is this coming to an end? And if you ask the German industry and look at the very critical statements that are coming out from there, the assessment is pretty clear. Yes, this is coming to an end, and we need to figure out what to do and how to not enhance our dependencies. Sorry, it's a really lengthy answer.
No, terrific, Amanda. Or you, okay, first. So
Okay.
you have the microphone. Right?
This is Umut.
No, you go ahead.
This is Umut. I'm a fellow also at the IBM. China is the biggest steel producer in the world and also a huge responsible country for creating emissions, greenhouse emissions. And this is basically because its entire steel sector is based on producing steel on basically coal. But we see a global shift from integrated steel mills into mini steel mills, which produce steel based on recycling scrap. So do you think there might be a kind of cooperation between the transforming Chinese steel sector from integrated steel mills into mini steel mills and the material basically cycle and demolition of buildings and also metals in Europe? There might be a kind of cooperation because linking Chinese mini steel mills with scrap metal is very important to push the transformation in China. Otherwise, Chinese companies are mostly attracted to war regions in order to extract scrap metal. So that's a kind of comment, and also just to push a little bit more on this link between the European material, basically infrastructure, and the Chinese steel company and their transformations. Thank you.
Thank you. If that's okay, I'll take it also more as a comment and as something to take on in my research, because I can't give you a proper answer to that. The only problem that I see at the moment with cooperation in general is that how do you deal with a situation where the other side is really not interested in cooperation? That is something that we're facing across the board in the relationship with China at the moment. There's seriously not a lack of cooperative, a willingness to cooperate from the European side at the moment. But no avenue has been particularly helpful. And some of the research that we've been doing around the climate conversation is actually based on the fact that we have this holy trinity, as I like to call it, in the European debate of China being at the same time a partner, a competitor, and a rival, a systemic rival. And I kept asking around in European capitals and said, okay, so what is in that partner box inside it at the moment? The answer I always got, every capital, was climate change. And then I was thinking, was that really true though? Isn't it a little bit more complex than that? Can we just kind of take this out and have this as like the single happy place of cooperation? And I think it's become pretty clear that it is not a happy place of cooperation at all, but it is a highly competitive field in which we have to figure out how to handle the situation that there is a dependency in terms of global climate change. And so the willingness from the European side to look and search for cooperative elements here, sustainable finance, for example, and development financing is one of these areas where we can even say criteria, establishing criteria together. These seem to be areas where there's an interest from the Chinese side as well, and where there's cooperation potential. But we really need to break this down into a much more nuanced debate than cooperating on climate change. So I think in that regard, cooperating on steel in area X, in area Y, could be one of those fields where you just actually break it down far enough so that you can have this conversation. But I think we can no longer afford in Europe to have the conversation of China is our partner on climate change. It's not.
Amanda.
Hello, my name is Amanda Coakley. I'm a fellow Europe's Futures Fellow. Good to have you both join us. So my question is about the Belt and Road and how it might contribute to regional instability, especially around the area of water, both in Central Asia. We know that there's growing concern in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan about water, but also on the border with India. And that relationship is quite tense at the best of times. So I'd really appreciate your insights on that. And then a second question, Pakistan. And I'm always curious to hear everyone's thoughts on Pakistan's beginning to wear now, it's beginning to grate the kind of implications of this amount of Chinese investment. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on from a political / military point of view, but then also given what's happened in Afghanistan, China has always throughout the negotiation played a very, good game with the Taliban. They've kept them on side. They seem to be kind of positioning themselves to do business in some way, shape, or form in Afghanistan, and whether that could actually disrupt what's happening in Pakistan, especially around Gwadar port, etc. So yeah, just appreciate your thoughts. Thank you.
Thank you.
I like the fellows thing. That's really nice. I should have said hello, fellows. This is really nice. So let me just be super brief here. I'm not an expert on Pakistan relations, and I'm not going to speak about things that I don't know anything properly about. What I can say is that on the Afghanistan conversation that we're having at the moment, there's a bit of a distortion in the international debate around it, that China has all of these massive investments so that it has to secure, and that it now has these massive interests, and it's going to go in there and flood the Taliban with money. I think that's highly overrated, that conversation. China is very interested in stability in Afghanistan. It's not very interested in who is governing it, as long as it is stable. But that's not for economic reasons. That's more for reasons of terrorism. It's more for kind of regional stability, and this not kind of pouring out into the broader region as a conflict scenario. That's certainly kind of the focus of the attention at the moment. This is not going to be a massively economically attractive area now where China finally can make money in Afghanistan. The conditions were much better when there was a greater stability provided by international troops in that regard. And even at the best of times, they didn't really make money there. So a lot of the projects that have been announced are stalled. A lot of this has not been really moving forward. So I'd be very cautious about that. And that also maybe answers a bit of the Pakistan question, or the BRI questions in general. There is this tendency to make the Belt and Road Initiative like 10 feet tall. It's like unbeatable, the amounts of money going in, we cannot match. It's just empirically not true. We can match the funds and resources. A lot of the projects have actually been not very successful. There is significant pushback in various regions. A lot of the investments are just silly investments. They haven't worked. Now, there are happy places of the BRI and less happy places of the BRI. And so this is not an across the board answer and say BRI is a failure. That's not true. What has definitely been a success is the narrative of the BRI. It has made China even more powerful as a global actor. It has called on US and Europeans to find answers to it. And despite the fact that you could say some of these areas are just not working, but it is the push, and it is the reason for Global Gateway and the Build Back Better World to find an answer to that. So I think in that regard, that's what China's been very successful at, is communicating about this and talking about this, not necessarily in delivering at all times. And in Pakistan, you have one of the best examples of where serious reckoning going on with the amount of Chinese promises and investment. You see a lot of that also in Eastern Europe. I think that's the debate you're having after the frenzy of MOUs and memorandum of understandings on the BRI that was signed in 2015 in Eastern Europe. And then a lot of fatigue around the promises that were made and the investment that just didn't come, and political ties that were there, but not really anything that came out of it. So this is something that is going into the political considerations at the moment, but also with like the little footnote here, and it's been adapting to that as well. And it's been adapting its narrative, and has been actually quite capable of doing that over the course of the time. So I wouldn't write this off and say this is going to be a complete fiasco.
Questions, comments? Let me ask a question while we wait. Wojciech, did you want?
Yeah.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Just very, Wojciech, I'm also, well, we
fellow.
spoke already. We're neighbors. We actually have office neighbors. So what do you make of this new thing that we've seen from Lithuania, from countries, small countries and countries, especially, lots of them in Central Europe, actually saying, no, we're not participating, or we're not buying this narrative? Is it something to, you expect that there's more of that coming on what's rational?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether there's more of that coming, and it would have certainly been even more powerful if it wasn't just Lithuania leaving the 17, now 16 plus 1, but if they had someone else by their side, obviously, as a narrative. But it is an interesting development that we're seeing in that regard. It means you can say no to China, you can reverse course on these issues, and there's actually very little they can do about it. And this is tiny Lithuania, is really angering the big partners in Beijing. I think it is a question of European solidarity in the end. Have we shown enough solidarity among the other European states in terms of backing Lithuania in its approach at the moment? Is that, is it good enough what we're displaying there? And then there's the other question, that is, how much should you push the envelope while you can? So is this a good time now to actually say, hang on, wait a minute, this is how we want things to be done? In Lithuania, this is a very domestic conversation based on domestic pressure, values-based foreign policy. There is a huge tradition of support for Tibet, support for Taiwan, support for Hong Kong that you have in the Lithuanian conversation. So, so this is something, should we not have that now while we can, and while we can just kind of push the Chinese on these issues? Shouldn't there actually be more of this all across Europe? Shouldn't we just be a lot more clear about where our interests lie? I think we're not there at the moment, also partly due to a lack of leadership from the German side on these issues. So let's see what next Sunday brings, whether we can see more action on that front after the election.
So let me ask you a question then that relates sort of to what you were saying about how Europe and the European Union reacts to what is going on. You mentioned, and we talked about that yesterday, this partner box, and when you ask, they don't really know what the partner dimension is. And linking to what you said about Germany making billions and realizing that that's ending. So the question is, well, two-tiered maybe, or three-tiered. Who in Europe is actually driving this attempt to coordinate policy to China, if at all anyone? Secondly, is the comprehensive agreement on investment dead in the water? And if it's not, what happens to it? And thirdly, some of our colleagues and your colleagues in Berlin, I've heard recently saying, well, Germany is a privileged interlocutor with China, and it could be the conduit to talking and looking for solutions. Is that true from your point of view? And if yes, is then Germany the preferred spokesman for Europe in China?
So let me start from the back.
Okay.
I think that ends on Sunday as well,
Okay.
Germany being the preferred interlocutor, because none of the new candidates for, doesn't precisely end on Sunday, because we know that it will take a while until we have a government, but Chancellor Merkel has been an enormous figure in the Germany-China relationship, and is seen with a lot of respect in Beijing as well. None of the candidates that are following her will have that same standing. So I think a lot of the kind of special relationship dynamic that we have is still based on this special relationship also that kind of comes from Chancellor Merkel's personal standing with Beijing. The other element is obviously that in terms of economic connections, Germany is the only European country that has these strong, where the economies are so strongly intertwined. The rest of the Europeans are strongly intertwined with the Germans, but the Germans are the ones that have actually the business in China, and where the business interests are the largest.
No one comes close to what Germany.
No, and I think that also leads to kind of the question, who will lead? If Germany does not lead a rethink around these issues, then no one really has the power to do so. And that's where it becomes particularly interesting to talk about the comprehensive agreement on investment, which sort of sneakily was pushed through between Christmas and New Year, where you saw a Franco-German axis emerging, this kind of 11th hour push at the end of the German council presidency for having a deliverable, something that you wanted, something that the German industry is actually saying is not really all that impactful for them. It's not really doing that much. It's not going to be so fantastic for them. This was an interesting experiment of seeing the pushback against it was already high even before the sanctions came. And now we're at a state where to make the comprehensive agreement on investment go through, you would need to see a lifting of sanctions on both sides. I don't think that that is very likely to happen at the moment. So I think I am careful to say things are dead in the water, because I've been surprised by many weird policy decisions over the past few years. So I wouldn't say we can forget about it already, but it will take a lot to revive it at the moment. And I don't see any dynamic of that sort emerging. China's already gotten out of it what it wanted, a big snub to the Biden administration at that point. And the de facto impact of the agreement, because it is so limited and is only a building block in a broader China strategy, is actually not that big. And And then who's driving this at the moment? So at the moment, the driver's seat's pretty empty, I would say. I think someone needs to take a hold of the steering wheel relatively quickly. And that cannot be Brussels, because the issue is far beyond economic policy, far beyond trade. This needs the member states, and it needs the full support of the member states, but it needs to also be bigger than just Paris and Berlin.
And a short add-on before we go over to Olivia, the announced trade and tech talks with the US that of course might not happen now because of AUKUS, but do you think, given everything that's happened, that in the background will lurk the whole China dimension of trade and tech when the US and Europe sit down at that table?
Yeah, there is a clear China policy that we're having at the moment, and because of China policy, and the Trade and Tech Council is because of China policy. We're talking about these things because they matter now in our relationship with China. They are the biggest challenger to what our kind of idea of trade and our technology infrastructure that we have at the moment, or the technology space. And this is where only together Europe and the United States can actually make a difference. And this is why this is important also to the United States. The United States cannot solve these questions by themselves. The Europeans are their most important partner on these questions. So in the economic space and in the technology space, Europe matters. And that's a good thing. It should actually lead the Europeans to approach these negotiations and to approach these conversations with a lot of strength. But it does seem like politics is getting in the way at the moment, and that the AUKUS deal will have a significant impact, which would be a shame, because this is actually the one area where delivering quickly would be incredibly necessary to also use the momentum that the Biden administration now has.
Well, lots of food for thought and research.
And we've moved far away from the initial conversation as well.
Well, that just goes to show, how important the subject is, because as we were saying, it touches upon practically every aspect that we're talking about. So thank you very much, Janka. And I turn to Olivia Lazar, who is a visiting scholar at Carnegie Europe, but hails from France. Her research focuses on the geopolitics of climate, the transition ushered by climate change, and the risks of conflict and fragility associated to climate change and environmental collapse. But Olivia comes from the environmental peacekeeping and mediation field, a practitioner and a researcher who has worked for over 12 years in the peacemaking sector, both at field and policy levels, with an original specialization in the political economy of conflict. Worked for various NGOs, the UN, EU, and donor states in the Middle East, Latin America, Sub-Saharan and North African parts of Asia. So you've really been around, and I hope that you will help us understand many things that are going on. Prior to joining Carnegie Europe, Olivia set up her own consultancy firm, Peace in Design Consulting, which remains exclusively active in conflict and fragile zones. Olivia's theme is how can the EU's green agenda go global? So Olivia.
Thank you, Ivan. Thank you, Janka, for a really exciting presentation. I'm really happy that, as I said, as you went first. And well, hello, everyone, fellow. Ivan, as you mentioned, I have a background in environmental peacemaking. So most of my career I've spent actually in conflict and fragile zones. And it's in those zones that I understood that the EU, the UN, the international community were missing the mark, a pretty big mark about climate action and environmental degradation. And I started working in the remits of the EU a few years ago, trying to raise some concerns about what was happening in terms of environmental degradation and climate disruptions in those different zones. And looking at you, Janka, because I found I might rebel on one of your comments about the fact that in China, environmental degradation and climate change are two different conversations, which I'm going to try and prove here are very much related to one another. And when we talk today about the EU and the Green Deal and being climate leaders, we need to take into account factors about obviously the climate diplomacy, as we were talking about, regarding how to decarbonize and how to decarbonize fast. The latest IPCC report in August of this year demonstrated essentially that climate disruptions are happening faster than anticipated. and that even compared to last estimates and scenarios, the EU is already falling behind. And this is even more the case today. So there is an element essentially of looking at decarbonization, but we need to look at more than decarbonization. And we need to understand the EU's sort of green agenda within a geopolitical environment, but also a biophysical environment. And that's the part that is mostly missing today. So when we address the question of how can the EU take its agenda globally, I'm going to try and sort of first go through some of the blind spots that we're currently encountering, how this is actually questioning the current state of play regarding the EU's climate diplomacy and Green Deal externalization, and potentially what we can do going forward. And that's probably going to be, the scope of my research at IWM. So let's start from the beginning. We all know that the European Union, as you were saying, Janka, likes to think of itself as a climate leader. It likes to be applauded as a climate leader on the international scene. And to be honest, compared to the rest of the international community, the EU is, yes, relatively advanced when it comes to policy packages regarding climate action. Since the start of the von der Leyen Commission, we have the EU Green Deal, which is considered as the cornerstone of the EU's green growth strategy. And President von der Leyen talked about, the EU Green Deal as the man on the moon moment for the European Union. So it is about a civilizational project, taking the EU into a next step of its own institutional, bureaucratic, political, economic, technological development. Originally, the EU Green Deal must be thought of as a response to democratic pressures within the European Union. So we were talking about the Fridays for Future movements, the Extinction Rebellion movements, and the fact that from a climate democracy perspective, we were seeing more and more fragmentation and dissension as a result of the lack or perceived lack of climate action. It also comes obviously as a response to the Paris Agreement and the various milestones that we're encountering, one of which is coming next month, in a month and a half, COP26, where we need to announce more formally the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, and push the rest of the global community towards upping those pledges. So the European Green Deal has an interesting double aspect to it. It is profoundly a regional and nationally determined policy package, which has global ambitions, or at least EU staff would like it to be. The focus is very much decarbonization and green growth transitions, which need to be thought through together. And if we were to sort of boil down what the green growth strategy is about in terms of measures, it would be about CO2 emission reductions, GDP, employment, and innovation proxies such as technological patents. The premise and the assumption upon which the green growth or the Green Deal strategy is based is essentially that the EU needs to retain, and that builds upon your presentation, needs to retain competitiveness through decarbonization strategies and in an era of new industrial revolution. And the aim is therefore, and this is where I'm going to try and debunk a little bit of that assumption, the aim is to dematerialize economic performance. By dematerialization, I mean digitalization. That's the moment when we have a coupling of the green growth strategy, green in terms of decarbonized, with technological and digital innovation. There is a hidden assumption behind that. The assumption is that by going digital, we decouple the economy from material use and we decouple the GDP measures from greenhouse gas emissions. I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. This is inexistent. From a scientific perspective, this does not happen, and the only way in which the decoupling of economic growth can happen away from material use is if you outsource your material use outside of your territory, and if it does not appear in your accounting system regarding greenhouse gases. So the main logic behind the Green Deal is one of technological and industrial revolution, which is aimed at trying to couple digitalization with new energy systems and to face the pressures and stand up to the pressures of economic competition with China, with the US, with India. Digitalization needs, obviously, investments into new energy systems, decarbonized ones, renewables, hydrogen, that power communication sectors, that facilitate faster mobility, and that empower technological innovation. So that means that the transition, the climate-related transition, will only be considered successful if it can deliver on all of these economic aspects. The climate transition is therefore conditioned by economic performance and a new industrial era within Europe and elsewhere. So this is a strategic picture in which we find ourselves at the moment, with a key tension at the heart of the transition, which is that the EU needs to couple this digital and green transitions because of a geopolitical environment that is more pressing than climate disruptions, at least for now. Let's put it this way. The argument is that the digital revolution will support and power through the climate transition. We're actually saying by digitalizing, we're making our future safer and saving the climate. If the EU fails on the tech revolution, then the EU's economic, political, and hard security may be threatened by other geopolitical actors such as China, and this is what you're mentioning, Janka. There are huge considerations to take into account that play into this transition. So for me, the central question, and this is a question that we started exploring in our research at Carnegie Europe, I'm going to have to direct you to a report that we issued in July of this year that has a number of maps that will be useful for this presentation, but unfortunately won't have them up. But the central questions that we started delving into with this research is, does the EU have the systemic lenses needed to address the tensions between geostrategic objectives and biophysical objectives, which I'll get into in a minute, trying to understand what is at stake in different areas of security, because we need to understand it from a multi-dimensional level, and if there are contradictions between the geostrategic ambitions and the need to secure biophysical stability and equilibriums. And then the follow-up question is essentially, is the EU adequately equipped to face the challenges associated with the tensions between geostrategic and biophysical objectives? So I'm going to run very quickly through the EU Green Deal, which is still in development and will be for a number of for some time. But the EU Green Deal very quickly aims to have at least 55% of greenhouse gas emission reduction by 2030 compared to 1990 levels. We aim to have full carbon neutrality by 2050. I insist on the neutrality aspect because it doesn't mean that we will stop emitting carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. It just means that we need to withdraw in one way, shape, or another carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We aim to have, as I was saying, economic growth decoupled from resource use and greenhouse gas emissions. And we aim to have no place and no people left behind. This is very much understood in European terms and to be associated with the transition mechanisms and the various funds that are helping or that are designed to help Europe to move as one into a decarbonized future. The Green Deal is a whole of EU approach, and that's the part where it gets interesting from an administrative and institutional perspective, because the Green Deal is essentially trying to pull together all the different threads that the EU has been working with and on over decades already, through DG Klima, through DG Environment, through the EAS a little bit, what used to be DEFCO, what is now INPA. It concerns essentially agricultural systems, food production, biodiversity, land use, forestry systems, circular economy, fisheries, energy sources, obviously, transportation, industrial innovation, finance, you name it, whole of EU approach, therefore creating a number of new tensions around this issue of siloization and cooperation between different parts of the EU, but we can get to that later. The latest announcements of the Green Deal came this summer, I think on July 14th, with the Fit for 55 package, which proposes 13 different sectors of legislative propositions for how to take the EU to 2030, at least decarbonize by 55% of greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels. And in this, again, we see a predominance of internal policy packages and industrial renovation or energy efficiency propositions regarding the construction sectors, the energy sectors, the transportation sectors, including maritime and aviation, and then the elements which sort of come across as being foreign policy related are actually about the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which obviously touches on steel and which a lot of partners or rivals or fear or have concerns about, because it touches on key specific industries for which the EU wants to protect its own competitiveness. And then we have climate diplomacy, which is writ very large. It's very difficult to really understand what climate diplomacy is about beyond decarbonization at the moment. It has started to include, issues around water and around climate security, and we can touch upon that in a minute. So before, the whole sort of narrative of the EU at the moment is how can we externalize the Green Deal? We're such good climate students. We need to sort of show the way and chart the path forward regarding the green transition. The way in which the foreign policy aspect has been discussed beyond the CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is how do we help fossil fuel dependent countries such as Algeria, potentially Russia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, usher into their own national future regarding, renewables, hydrogen, et cetera, et cetera. So the focus again has been very much on carbon dioxide. There is an issue with that, and it's the part that is starting to stick and that we will need to sort of delve a lot more into when it comes to foreign policy within the next few months and next few years. We need to start looking at the blind spots and therefore what the implications of the regional policy packages and the new supply chains and value chains that the EU wants to create will have on partners and countries abroad. So the first thing to realize, again, is the Green Deal has been sold through by Europeans for Europeans. The foreign policy aspect has only started to be discussed in the past few months and only focused on decarbonized issues, and potentially now on what the impacts of climate change are going to be. The conversation is starting a little bit at home, considering what happened in Germany and in Belgium this summer, but historically it has been very much sort of outsourced to what is happening outside of Europe. The fact that the foreign policy dimension has been omitted from the design phase of the Green Deal means that there are tremendous gaps in terms of where do we source our materials, for example, for the decarbonized and digital transitions, which rely on critical materials. And I believe that you have a really interesting report on that at ECSFR, which you published last year, right? The critical materials at the moment is understood within the EU as a massive security issue, mostly because it leads us to dependence on China. And historically, we have been dependent on China. First, because China is very well endowed in those critical materials resources. Second, because we were more than happy for the last 20 to 30 years to outsource environmental destruction to China, which China has turned to its very, very strong advantage, because it means that it has vertically integrated supply chains all the way down from extraction of these materials to processing to exporting. China has become central to European, American, and quite frankly, global transition pathways regarding decarbonized technologies. So the EU is seeking to lower its dependency on China, including on those critical materials. So where is it going to look for those critical materials? And I really regret not having a map in front of you to show you. The critical materials that we're talking about are located quite specifically in conflict and fragile zones, quite specifically in between the tropics and in some parts of Southern Africa, of Southern America, and in the deep seas, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. The fact that we have not thought through the new wave of dependencies and extractions and exploration in those conflict and fragile zones, which have very little environmental, social, and governance safeguards, and which are usually sort of, countries that function or have institutions very often that are built on a predation system that relies on extractive industries that create marginalization, fragility, inequality, and inequity, means that we're not only exporting or outsourcing environmental destruction outside of the European Union, meaning that we can say, yes, we're decoupling. We're decoupling because we're outsourcing. It also means that we're actually exporting violence, insecurity, and conflicts to places that are already pretty fragile and whose instability is already feeding into international instability at a moment when the multilateral system is very fragile itself. But there is another dimension also to this element of the critical materials. Not only are they located in those conflict and fragile zones, for the most part, they're located in the underground of the critical ecosystems, natural ecosystems that remain somewhat standing and whose purpose, not sole purpose, but one of the purpose of these critical ecosystems is to regulate the global climate regime. From a biophysical perspective, if those critical ecosystems fall, even if we were to transition tomorrow to decarbonized systems, the climate crisis would still be going completely insane. Not only that, we would have more and more issues with water, because the purpose also of these critical ecosystems is to generate and distribute atmospheric river systems that are bigger than the land, river systems that we know, which essentially allow the distribution of various nutrients from one ecosystem to the other, transregionally, but also transcontinentally. So if we end up plundering the Amazon or the Congo Basin, or some regions in Myanmar or Indonesia as a result of our energy purposes, our green growth strategies, we will very quickly create water insecurity, food insecurity, and more generically, security issues within the countries that are directly concerned. But we will also experience it at home, because the more you actually plunder those ecosystems, the more you supercharge the atmosphere with the most potent greenhouse gas, which is water vapor. It is not carbon dioxide. You actually compound the effects of carbon dioxide the more you actually emit water into the atmosphere. So the trick and the irony, the real irony in our strategy is that we're actually pitting the climate against the environment within our green growth strategies. That will lead us 10, 15 years from now to having an EU fortress strategy. Let's push out all the migrants. Let's push out all the insecurity. Let's militarize. That will play into democratic fragmentation within the European Union, as we've already seen. And that will play on our own fragilities. The more we ignore the way in which our strategies will impact the rest of the world, the more we'll actually import insecurity back and potentially political fragmentation of the EU. The other map that I would have liked to show you, which I need to again sort of divert you to the report for, is the fact that there is a tension that we need to reconcile in our green growth strategy beyond what I've just explained, which is that scientists have identified all of the sort of critical ecosystems as the key priority areas for regeneration, ecological regeneration to happen. So on the one hand, we have our most important strategy, which is green growth, probably having very deleterious effects on those ecosystems. On the other hand, we have scientists telling us we need to actually switch gears and to actively, partner with nature, not just through nature-based solutions, but through very elaborate systems of ecological regeneration to really fight off the climate crisis and recreate different types of economies, which are bioregional rather than, sort of relying on global supply chains, which are, becoming detrimental to environmental health. And the last blind spot, how much more time do I have?
A couple of minutes.
Okay. The last blind spot that I'll quickly run through is the narrative around technology will save the climate and will save us all. Again, this features very heavily into the green growth thing. There are two aspects to it. One is the carbon capture systems. This is integrated within the IPCC scenarios. We've reached such levels of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere that we will not be able to get away without carbon capture systems. Let's be honest though, the first big carbon capture system went live last week in Iceland. It actually emits more carbon dioxide than it can capture. So we're still relying on fantasy carbon dioxide capture systems, which will, and that's the sort of John Kerry narrative, take us into a carbon-free future. The second aspect, again, is very much sort of related to the digitalization aspect and the decoupling narrative. As I've tried to demonstrate, the decoupling is not happening. We need to take that into account. Otherwise, the EU will simply sort of go right into a wall with the rest of the world. So very quickly, are all of these dimensions recognized in the EU's sort of foreign policy or green growth strategy? No. The current foreign policy instruments related to climate are the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the emission trading system, the climate diplomacy lets help fossil dependent countries move away from fossil dependency. So again, very carbon focused. We have an interesting new mechanism or sort of a tool, which is the taxonomy, very much related to private sector activity and ESG standards. The problem is it's not fully coherent because we have a lot of biofuels in there and some issues around where to direct investment. Second, it's on a voluntary basis, right? And we have no audit, monitoring and evaluation systems to really sort of check on the compliance of certain private actors in key areas where destabilization or ecological disruptions may happen. All of these different things in any case are carbon specific. They're not biophysical, systemic measures of progress. So the three-tier challenges that the EU will need to face very quickly, if not now, if not yesterday, is yes, obviously, let's decarbonize. There is no question that this needs to happen and it needs to happen fast. We need to also adapt to the incoming climate disruptions, and even the latest IPCC reports, underestimates the pace and impact and scope of all of the climate disruptions that we're going to face all at once in various regions, and which will have a tremendous impact on financial capacity of the multilateral system. And we need to already now think of how to mitigate the impacts of environmental destruction related to the climate mitigation plans and address next generation partnerships, to sort of echo what President von der Leyen was saying in the State of the Union address. We need to address the geopolitical competitions that we're stuck in at the moment, and which is overarching between the US and China. We need to look at new analytical systems that understand security from a multidimensional perspective. And we need to actually sort of actively adopt regenerative paradigms within foreign policy of the EU, so as to really become the climate leaders that we aim to be. I'll stop there because otherwise I can continue for a while.
Terrific. Thank you, Olivia. Wow, that's quite a mouthful. Janka, you have the privilege of asking the first question.
Yeah, first of all, I think I was struck by the fact that all of the stuff that we are underestimating at the moment, not only China's economic development and China's strategies here, but also the speed with which climate, what could possibly go wrong is the first initial comment that I would have. I do have a question on CBAM though, because we've kind of been brushing over it, but it is obviously one of the big issues that is on the agenda at the moment. And I would just like to hear your assessment of it. Is it a useful tool in what you are describing? You say, this is actually one tool that we have in the toolbox. Is it one that you say, well, it's actually, it's a good start. Let's start with this. Let's go ahead with this. Or is this also a fantasy policy that is actually regulating yesterday's problems? If we think about China potentially creating special environmental zones that produce at zero carbon emissions, where the products that are produced there are then shipped to our borders and have no CBAM to face, where the rest of the country looks very different though. So what is your assessment of that? Is that something that is relevant in as part of the mix, or should we forget about it already and focus our political energy elsewhere?
So everything, obviously, in all of these conversations, the devil hides in the detail, right? My perspective is that, yes, to accompany decarbonization efforts, if it is introduced gradually, which is the plan, it will be useful, particularly to put pressure on, actors that are indeed sort of, heavily carbon reliant, such as China for steel and, cement, and Turkey as well, and, Egypt, et cetera, et cetera. It will complicate bilateral relationships between all of the countries, well, between EU countries and all of the partner countries concerned. But it will create, it is about using the power of, the EU's market in order to accompany decarbonization efforts. And it has proven to work in the past. The Brussels effect is indeed, like something that has been used to promote certain environmental regulations or environmental systems and advancements in terms of protection. That said, at the end of the day, in building upon what you were saying, the carbon-free zones, et cetera, how do we check? What are the monitoring evaluation systems that can, tell us, well, this is very carbon heavy, whilst this is not? It's not just a question of where it is produced, it's where do you start taking into account the carbon emissions? Is it at the moment of extraction, such as I was demonstrating, for example, with the critical materials? The critical materials are not counted as carbon emissions for the most part, because we start counting carbon emissions at the moment when there is a combustion, not at the moment when there is environmental extraction, with all of the sort of transportation that happens all around the globe, et cetera, because it's a lot more difficult to calculate all of those emissions. So at the end of the day, everything will depend on how fast we introduce the CBAM measures, what sectors are specifically targeted. We already know that steel and cement will be heavily targeted by this. It's great to target the carbon heavy sectors. How do you replace them? How do you substitute for them? What is the innovation that will accompany the transition towards sectors that we rely upon because we all need them? So what are the different innovations, including within the industrial sectors, that the EU is trying to sort of incubate and therefore sort of really propel itself in terms of the industrial evolution and competitiveness, trying to promote a number of different patents or, innovations that it can then couple its sort of restriction policy, which the CBAM is, with let's cooperate indeed. And so I think it was driving back to this question of the steel, it's about how do you incubate competitiveness within the EU, since this is, one of the main concerns, whilst protecting your market, whilst at the same time not closing the door to cooperation avenues that can really take the climate fight forward, because, and this is the sort of fundamental rift to sort of, or tension to navigate. So yes, useful, in theory, in practice, let's see how it happens, how we develop the right mechanisms in place to check on the emissions, to check on, to spur innovation and to therefore accelerate transitions towards substitutes for key materials that we all need, essentially.
Okay, let's open it up for questions and answers. Amanda is first this time.
Take that, Sully. In joke. No, so I just wanted to ask you both, actually, there is crossover between geostrategic objectives and biophysical objectives on the issue of quantum computing. And I'm really interested in it. I was in Jülich Computing Center maybe 2 or 3 years ago, just after the Sycamore calculation. And there was this kind of big, I was speaking to people in Brussels about this big kind of quantum race between Europe and China and the United States. And it's everything, all its implications from climate change to security. So that's my first question I'd like to ask you both. Where does quantum computing fit into this? And then in relation to the fragile zones, do you think that there could be clashes between the European Union wanting to mine certain materials and the Belt and Road Initiative's interests in Africa, in South America, and what could that mean for the relationship between the two?
Between Europe and China, or between Europe and those countries? Right. I'll let you take the quantum computing thing. Sure. No, so I know, obviously the quantum computing is outside of my expertise, but it will be very, interesting to maybe discuss what you've heard. What's interesting are the conversations that are happening within the European Union about, okay, so we're starting to understand, obviously, that mining critical materials is going to have a cohort of environmental effects that are detrimental, that will create instability, and it already is. In Europe, outside Europe. So can we find, again, we revert back to the conversation around innovation. Can we find alternative sources of power? So we're looking, for example, at seawater and sodium, for example, for batteries. We're looking at different types of algae, for example. And then, comes in the question, which has been the age-old question about renewables. Will it ever be enough to power, like the type of economic models that we have, the type of mobility that we want to have, the type of technological innovation, including around quantum, I believe, that we need to sort of power through. So some of the most interesting conversations, I believe, in Europe are going to be about what type of innovation is truly going to serve our purpose of, being more environmentally sound. I'm not even saying friendly, because at this point we're really not friends with the environment, and more coherence. So it's about sort of going into, okay, are there any type of technological innovations that can really take us there without creating new types of massive monocultures of algae or stuff like this, which will also be detrimental to biodiversity. So opening up all those sort of multi-dimensional analytical monitoring and evaluation systems around how we measure performance, and this notion of progress, which at the moment is very, very heavily from a philosophical perspective, as well as biophysical perspective, is very, very heavily driven by a technological agenda. On the fragile zones, so if I understood your question correctly, it's about how the European Union would explore and therefore try to create mining or extractive ventures within fragile zones, and how it might collide with Chinese interests. Yeah. It's already happening in the aid sector. It is, but it's not, the spotlight is not on this. It will appear more and more, and here we really need to sort of read into the subtext of what is the BRI, what place do critical materials hold within the BRI? And I would really like to hear your views on this as well. And what kind of strategy is there from a European perspective? Because to my knowledge, we still don't have a one EU strategy regarding critical material exploration. You have Germany looking into Central Asia, you have France looking into the Indo-Pacific, particularly in its former colonies, current extraterritorial, pieces of land or sea. You also have a lot of exploration happening in Central Africa and Southern Africa. And again, the tension and what is likely to, if I focus on the perspective of those fragile countries, because politics in fragile countries is often, I know that this is maybe too blunt of a way to say it, but it's often predatory and corrupt. there is a lot of internal competition within the government and within a number of different economic and political gatekeepers around those governments. So it's very easy to a certain extent for outside actors to exploit this political and institutional strategy or fragility to their advantage, which either members of the European Union or the US or China or India or Russia will do. And you see, I mean, like one of the places where I find the competition most interesting from an intellectual perspective, most horrifying from a real life perspective is the Central African Republic, which is very heavily endowed in those critical materials, which is heavily fragmented in terms of security and territorial administration, and where you see all those fluxes of geopolitical competition between France, Russia, China, some countries in the Middle East, and from neighborhood countries, essentially. So that means that on the one hand, you may have efforts to stabilize the country, pouring a lot of aid into this country, whilst at the same time having to face geopolitical competition, which is essentially undermining any hope of stabilization for the country.
Okay, any other questions? I have two questions here from our virtual audience. So I'll tackle those before those in the audience here. The first one is from our colleague and friend, Dino Pasalic. So I'll read it out. While Slovenian coal-fired power plant is creating hundreds of millions of euro in debt due to the carbon tax, China is running some of Europe's biggest polluters in Southeastern Europe unimpeded. Is the green transition game between EU and China fair? And if not, how can the field be leveled?
The game's not fair.
No.
I think that's the easy answer to that one. And to level it, we will have to bring a lot to the table at the moment. And it will require some really uncomfortable choices about how we want to close our market off. How do we want to close our territory off to certain investments? How do we deal with the nexus between kind of the need for investment in infrastructure and our ability to provide that ourselves? And how do we kind of regulate and build incentives for a transition or an energy transition in the countries that are very close to our borders? That is absolutely essential, or within the EU. So I think that's the fundamental question, but I think it's not something that we can probably delve into in greater detail right now. I think what the one issue that you mentioned, I think the innovation issue is the big question that we need to solve, and I think that's one that also drives me intellectually nuts at the moment, that we're at a stage where, in light of the climate crisis that we're facing, we will need all of the brains possible globally to find innovative solution for transition and for kind of maintaining prosperity while transitioning to a different kind of economy. And at the same time, we have a fragmentation and a decoupling of also our innovation spaces, of trust in research, of trust in science. And I think that is the area where, particularly in the EU-China conversation at the moment, in the US-China conversation at the moment, the more we fragment these innovation spaces, because quantum computing is also relevant for military application, et cetera, and we can't trust each other anymore, we can't have those researchers going back and forth anymore, the more we stifle our actual potential to address the climate crisis. And I think that's something that we cannot easily make up for at the moment.
I cannot not make the parallel with the way that we're dealing with the pandemic globally to your question. I mean, the huge fragmentation, leaving out all parts of the world out of this, where, you know, Africa is 1% vaccinated. The desire to have the brains come together, won't happen tomorrow. I'll read out the second question because it's for Olivia. It comes from our first year fellow, Luke Cooper, in London. Her discussion of critical materials. You mentioned a tendency for sites of extraction to have serious problems with violent conflict and very weak non-existent social and labor protections. To what extent do we need to think about a new economic model here? The old Western model based on low investment, super exploitation of local labor is now joined by a new Chinese model based on high investment and Chinese, not local labor. Neither of these seems adequate and raises obvious moral issues. Are we doomed to be stuck with this choice? Also, thanks to both for an excellent presentation.
I think it's an excellent question because at the end of the day, it drives back to the source of the problem, which is, without wanting to sound cliche, it's very true that the perpetual economic growth addiction that we have essentially drives us beyond biophysical and planetary boundaries. The planetary boundary concept was created by the Stockholm Environmental Institute a number of years ago and looks at 9 different planetary boundaries which we cannot cross unless we essentially undermine the very existence of human life, not life as a whole, but of human life and human civilization on the face of the earth. If we keep on sort of trying to evade that fundamental question of the tension between geo-economic systems and political economic systems that take us constantly out of those biophysical boundaries, then we will not be able to address the fundamental driver of the equation. And that means that we will rely on the Musks and Bransons of this world to take a very tiny proportion of human life, potentially to Mars, where the ability to sustain human life on Mars is far from being proven. So at the end of the day, if we look at the relationship between the EU and those fragile and conflict zones, where the next wave of economic growth needs to be sourced from, we can look at a number of different strategies. We can look at an ability, for example, of the EU to potentially enter into new formats of dialogue with the US, China, India, and a number of geopolitical partners to reason the economic system out of environmental extraction and try to indeed, open new avenues of cooperation. This is extremely difficult, as Janka, you were, outlining at the moment, because trust is being eroded, because, the green growth transition has become about competitiveness and sort of hegemonic power in the 21st century, et cetera, et cetera. So can we find some kind of new type of diplomacy that the EU is in a unique position, for that matter, to actually lead? That I'm convinced of, because we have some of the sort of regulatory, political, ethical paradigms that help us to take that reflection forward, compared to, for example, the US, which is heavily reliant on market-based solutions and non-regulatory policies towards the climate crisis. We can look at indeed different types of industrial, innovation strategies, et cetera, et cetera. But I do profoundly believe, and this is my unresearched personal position at the moment, that very quickly we will need to anticipate a conversation within Europe, which is about alternative economic models at home. There are conversations starting about degrowth in a number of countries, France being ironically a very active actor in this conversation, with a number of we can see that there is some government staff are actually sort of being refractory to the degrowth narrative, which shows essentially that it's picking up within civil society and that people are asking questions. We've heard, a number of different government ministers actually trying to equate degrowth with regression, such as the one that we're experiencing as a result of COVID, which is fundamentally demagogic, because degrowth is about a strategic economic sort of path, rather than something where we just say, oh, let's all, go into unemployment and be happy about it. So I think that there will be more and more research needed, which need to be supported by the European Union, in terms of Horizon 2020 or other types of sort of research packages, which look at technological innovation for sure, but also socioeconomic innovations and new types of economic models that first really center on how can we reconcile political, economic, and territorial administration in a way that makes sense and recreates social fabrics, economic fabrics on the basis of bioregional economies. But if we head towards this, what kind of what kind of world does it give? Because then we start questioning international trade, we start questioning mobility at international level, we start questioning globalization. So it has a number of repercussions, which for that matter, people who are advocates of degrowth at the moment of Europe, do not engage with these questions, which means that it's very easy to tell them, your theory doesn't hold, because the stability, and this is the part that I find that blows my mind, we've built the stability of the international system coming out of the Second World War on this notion of economic interdependencies. This is particularly strong in Europe because this is how we created the European project. What is coming to question this is actually the integrity of ecological interdependencies that we've never looked into before as a matter of security and as a matter of sustenance of our economic systems. So the more we try to sort of look into how to reconcile those different equilibriums, the more we have a chance of actually sort of making it through a climate disrupted world, which is coming our way, which is already here and which is going to worsen. It doesn't need to be all bleak. I know that my presentation can have that dampening effect on people. It doesn't need to be all bleak. We have some ways in which we can reinvent our relationship to ecological systems through economic, political, and administrative systems.
Okay. There's one final question. We've run out of time, actually. So very quickly, please, both.
So when we talk about these things, we always like have a dominating solution of investing in technology. And we know from the Javanese paradox that the more we invest in technology, then the price of the commodity is decreased so that there's a more consumption. So I think this idea is coming from basically our fetish of the economic growth, that we never think about the growth. And we're talking about decoupling, but what is happening is relative decoupling, not absolute decoupling.
Sure.
And which we need is not the relative one, but the absolute one.
Yeah.
So you're talking about this, socioeconomic change. You're telling it, but you're not really, saying the word, which is reducing consumption. We never talk about reducing consumption in Europe in related to these topics. I think this is in a way like the new church of Europe, in a way, the shopping malls and the shopping streets, but we never bring this reducing consumption debate and link it with to the climate change. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take Solly's question and then we'll have final comments.
I just wanted to thank you for a very uplifting talk. And as you spoke, I thought of this movie with Jodie Foster and Matt Damon, Elysium, where the rich live in space, but they cannot really escape the poor that are down on Earth. And my question will not be either technological or environmental, but on your last point, is there any reason to hope that at least in the developed world, the so-called Generation Z can do what Umut was suggesting? That is, push for an acceptance of stationary stage. But then what do you do really with an exploding world population, most of whom will be living in areas where the soil is no longer going to be productive and water will have dried out? So it becomes very dystopic. That's why it was so uplifting hearing it.
Yes, I realize again that I can have a role of Cassandra from time to time. It's not why I'm here, because I repeat, there are good news, and I'll just rebound very quickly on your question around, first on a comment that soils will become unproductive and that we will have water scarcity. So what I've seen from my own eyes through regenerative projects at small scale and at big scales, including in China, is that you can actually bring back soil fertility and you can bring back water, including in places where it has disappeared. So the whole thing, and this is a key thing that you will need to start understanding, a key to the climate crisis is working with the hydrological cycle. So the movement of water from liquid to gas and back from gas to liquid. The more we manage to actually sort of plant the water every drop of water that we can draw from the atmosphere, the more we will be able to fix carbon into the soils and therefore reboot ecological functions. And this is not just about saying, oh, let's plant trees, because this is part of the horrific solutions of the net zero transition, which is just, you know, sending carbon accounting over the roof and makes no sense. It is about essentially sort of recreating relationships with the land and with the ecosystems that is both regenerative and productive. And you can only have sustainability on the basis of regeneration cycles. If you say, let's, you know, sustain, for example, the desert, not really much point to that, at least the deserts that are not ecologically active. So my point is, yes, there is hope with the new generations, because more and more people are starting to understand that institutions are lagging behind and falling into easy sort of, you know, tick the box kind of solutions. But a lot of people, and they're sort of growing into different movements, are headed towards regenerative paradigms, and therefore decrease of consumption levels, and, you know, being sort of a lot more active also from a democratic perspective into pushing that agenda. It is still considered marginal and a bit sort of rebel-like within, you know, the sort of democratic landscape of Europe in general, including in fairly progressive countries. But we will get there, the same way that we've gotten to the point where, you know, the climate advocates who were very vocal 30 years ago and considered complete pariahs are now front and center into climate democracy debates. We need to go faster though. But yes, there is hope. There will always be hope. That's the good part. And hope will always coexist with
doom and gloom.
Doom and gloom. And that's just the way it is. It was this way during, like, I was raised by a family which was really impacted by the Second World War. This was the message, right? If optimism fails, pessimism is not the answer. Courage is. You have to deal with the circumstances that life hands to you. Now, on the question of the tech paradox and consumption, I'll build upon your tech paradox. There is an issue at the moment which really bugs my mind within the green growth narrative. If we rely so heavily on tech, then we create pockets of capital predation. And obviously, it's no wonder that we see, you know, like the people who are extremely wealthy and extremely capital endowed, such as Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, invest into new political ventures and new fund managing, you know, ventures, including in Greenland, for example, to try and create consortiums that are about, oh, how do we innovate around this green tech transition? So you actually perpetuate pockets of power which are facilitated by economic systems which tend to not use the right tax regimes, for example, or not use the right regulatory regimes. And that we will need to address, because otherwise we will see essentially a sort of green growth strategy, which is very much accompanied by more inequity, more inequality, more marginalization, more social fracture, and more difficulty for the political realm to actually usher inclusive policies towards, well, climate transitions, right? And so it leads, and your two questions are related. Yes, of course, overconsumption is the part of the problem. It's not the only one, but it's part of the problem. I see some hope, again, to rebound on, you know, the good news. The EU has just introduced, for example, you know, like, it takes like simple measures like this that make precedents, right? The EU has, for example, now just imposed or is about to introduce an imposition to all tech giants such as Apple and whatever to use the same connective battery system so as to avoid creating so much waste, avoid creating, you know, like marginal innovation, because, you know, when Apple, you know, retorts, well, you're limiting our capacity to innovate. I don't really see the difference between the Mac that I have now and the Mac that I had 5 or 7 years ago. So through little, but that have, you know, very important impact, measures like this, and using the regulatory power of the EU, there will be, slowly a move towards, well, what kind of capitalism do we want? Is it sort of, constantly creating marginal waste and marginal value? Or do we want something that actually recreates an economy that has meaning and purpose? Because that's what people are craving, including within democratic debates.
Good. Janka, final word is yours.
I don't know if I can add something to this, but I think maybe the one thing that what I didn't say in my remarks, stressing the kind of wake-up call for the Europeans, was stressing that we think we are ahead, but we're not, and we have to be really careful about what is happening here in terms of creating the kind of competitiveness that we want to have for ourselves, and we don't want to be energy dependent on China. But this can also create an enormous race to the top, and that's something that is giving a lot of hope in the end, that by kind of trying to outdo each other on the greenest economy to attract manufacturing, to have the best energy system, to have the most efficient telecommunications system, to have that can also create conditions that, at the best of all cases, help spur the kind of innovation that we need. And that does not necessarily require partnership. It actually works as well in a very competitive space. So maybe that is the one positive aspect that we can see from this, where we can say, despite the fact that we will not be partners with China on climate change in all aspects of it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it will have to fail.
Terrific. Thank you. Just let me check. I think we do have a wine and cheese downstairs. So I invite you all to come down to our refectory for a conversation, along with some wine and cheese, and I believe very nice sweets. I also remind you that next week, Wednesday, on the 28th, we have our final colloquium with our last two fellows who are to present, Valbona Zinelli and Soli Ozel, who are here with us in the room. And now please join me in thanking both Janka and Olivia for terrific talks.